On today's show, how well will the Predators do in the Central Division this year? One national writer is weighing in, and Preds fans may cringe at where he has the team falling this year. Plus, we'll talk about the Preds prospect pipeline compared to some of the other teams in the NHL. And fantasy hockey is right around the corner. Who are going to be some of the top performing Preds this year? We'll talk about it today on the Locked On Predators podcast.
You're Locked On Predators, your daily podcast on the Nashville Predators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making the Locked On Predators podcast your first listen of the day. Every single day, we are your free daily Nashville Predators podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, we want to start out with a special hello to our loyal Locked On Pred heads out there, the everydayers who tune into every single show. We love you guys. We appreciate the support you give us week after week. I'm Nick Morgan. I'm a writer at Penalty Box Radio. Normally, I have a partner in crime, Ann Kimmel from InsideThePreds.com, but she has the day off. I also want to mention today's episode is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL for a free water bottle with any order. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you. On today's show, we are going to be hearing from the Locked On NHL Prospects people today. They're going to be talking about how deep the Nashville Predators pipeline is compared to some other teams in the NHL. They just put out their national rankings. We'll see where the Preds rank. Plus, hockey season is right around the corner when we are dropping the word fantasy hockey. Who are going to be the Preds' biggest fantasy contributors this year? Maybe a couple of fantasy dark horses on the team this year. We're going to be talking about NHL.com's prediction for that as well. But we will start with some Central Division preview talk. There's already some, debates and standings and projections and stuff coming out for next year. The latest comes from the Hockey News and Adam Proto, well-regarded writer. He has the Nashville Predators finishing 5th in the Central Division this year. Here's his full standings. He had Dallas finish 1st. No arguments there. Colorado finishing 2nd. Again, no arguments there. St. Louis Blues 3rd. Maybe an argument there. 4th, he's got Minnesota. Then the Nashville Predators. Right behind him in 6th is the Winnipeg Jets. Then Arizona in 7th and Chicago in 8th. First reaction to this is Predators finishing 5th. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to argue against that. Like, maybe they're kind of on the same par as St. Louis right now. Like, maybe you make that argument, but, I certainly don't think they're more clear-cut better than any of the 4 teams ahead of them on the list. You can also argue, hey, maybe Winnipeg maybe deserves to be slotted higher on them just because of all the times Winnipeg has had the Predators number over the past couple of years. So the placement of the Nashville Predators in the Central Division predictions, that's not much of a big story. I think a lot of people kind of predicted, that's kind of exactly where the Nashville Predators should end up. They are by far and away better than Arizona and Chicago, and not good enough to contend with the top. And that puts us in what Adam Proto calls the quote-unquote mushy middle. This is a spot that has a lot of Predators fans concerned because in, sort of the landscape of the NHL, a lot of people think this is the worst spot to be in, is that mushy middle. Basically, the concept is you're not good enough to be like a legitimate contender in the NHL, or as Adam Proto says, they're just bad enough to fail to qualify for the playoffs. But they're also good enough that they're not in the basement. They're good enough to stay out of the basement, which means they're not going to get like a top 5 pick unless they just have some insane lottery luck. They're not going to have like all these like number 1, number 2, number 3 overall picks coming to them because they're good enough to be better than those bottom feeding teams, but not good enough to be a legitimate contender. And over the years, that has become, sort of the toughest place for an NHL team to be in. Now, how do the Predators get out of there? There's two ways of looking at this. There's a lot of people in the camp of, if you're in that mushy middle, it's not worth being there. Tear down, try to lose, get some of these number 2, number 3 prospects, try to go for a number 1 overall pick and start building a super team. That's one way to look at it. And that is, certainly a risky thing to do, especially when you have some players like UC Saros and Roman Josi, who are legitimate game-changing players in the NHL. The other way to look at that is that, hey, the Nashville Predators are in the middle of the pack. They're already better than a lot of teams trying to claw their way up right now. They're already halfway to maybe being up on that top tier. Maybe instead of going the other way, make yourself super bad so you can skyrocket towards the top. Maybe you're in a position where you don't have to go through those 5-6 year painful rebuilds. Maybe you're good enough to look at your team and say, okay, what are we good at and what do we still need? Maybe that's a good place for the Nashville Predators to be in. They haven't hit rock bottom yet. That's not nothing, people. And I think in this day and age, a lot of people think you have to suck because you need, a Jack Hughes, a Nathan McKinnon, a Connor Bedard, this game-changing number 1 pick who is going to rapidly, help your team ascend to the pantheon of NHL contenders. Not every team needs to do that. Number 1, not every team is going to have that same lottery luck. You may suck, you may tank, and you may still wind up with the 4th overall pick or 5th overall pick. And in some years, as we've seen, that's not good enough to get a game-changing talent. Just ask the Detroit Red Wings. Ask the Arizona Coyotes, who have, been very, very bad over the past decade, but haven't gotten any lottery luck whatsoever fall their way. There's a lot of teams like that. So if you're the Nashville Predators, it's not a bad thing to take a step back, be in the middle, especially this year when you have a lot of players coming up in the system. Take a legitimate look and say, okay, we're in the middle of the pack now, but that also gives us a good chance to see how we stack up against some of these teams that are better than us. What do we still need to do? What can we do, with our young players? Like, do we have the prospects to get there? Do we need to do more? Do we need to be more aggressive at maybe getting a game-changing piece? Do we need to do something different in development? To me, that's a better way of doing it than just throwing in the towel and intentionally trying to be bad. Because the way everybody talks about it, like, you intentionally try to be bad for a few years, you stockpile picks and then work your way up. As we've seen in the NHL, that doesn't always work out. Or if it does, it may take years and years and years and years. Like, yeah, the Oilers got Connor McDavid, and I think that's worth it. But a lot what people don't mention is it took them 10 years to get him, and 3 other number 1 picks to get Connor McDavid on the roster, and they still have not won a game in the 3rd round of the playoffs since 2006. The Toronto Maple Leafs finally just won their first playoff series since 2004, despite all of the top-end picks that they have. And yeah, I mean, they're close to a cup. They're closer to a cup than Nashville, but that doesn't always guarantee success. And then you think of all these other teams, like the San Jose Sharks right now, or, the LA Kings, or, the Calgary Flames, these teams that have kind of been perpetually bad, Arizona, another team, perpetually bad, and just haven't figured out a way to get themselves to the top yet. It's not a sure thing. So for the Nashville Predators, especially this year, to be considered middle of the pack, that's not a bad thing. Maybe some things change. Maybe the Predators wind up getting a little bit further back, and then you have to take the step and say, okay, we're stuck in a spot we don't want to be in. how do we change this? But for now, I would say middle of the pack is just as good as you can expect for the Nashville Predators team. We're going to be talking more about some of the players that can help the Nashville Predators maybe reach that next echelon. We're talking about how deep the prospect pipeline is for the Nashville Predators. We're going to be talking about that in just 1 second. But first, we want to mention today's episode brought to you by one of my favorite sponsors, Bird Dogs. We have reached what I call peak Knicks season right now. We got football in the mornings and early afternoons. You got maybe some golf or a day on the lake in the afternoon, and then a nice date night to cap the night off. There's a lot of stuff going on, which means you don't always have the time to change into 50 different outfits. And that's why I need my pair of Bird Dogs with me, because these are the pants that not only feel good and feel comfortable, but look great. Bird Dog stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, which give you a truly sculpted look, but it's got that same kind of Lululemon fit, like the stretch fabric that feels light. It's not that stiff, restricting cotton that a lot of khaki shorts have. No, the Bird Dog's cloud knit fabric looks like khaki, but it stretches to give you a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. And their anti-stink sweat wicking fabric keeps you cool and dry all day long. So you can wear these pretty much anywhere. You can use them just lounging around the house. They're very comfy. You can wear them out on the golf course and still feel like nice and cool, relaxed, but still take them out on a nice night on the town. They look fabulous. Trust me, Bird Dogs look great in any occasion. So try it yourself. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL at checkout for a free Bird Dogs water bottle with your order. Again, that's birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL for a free water bottle at checkout. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you. All right. So the Nashville Predators, a big part of their future is going to hinge on the prospects. How well some of these young players do. Can they step up and take on a big role for the Nashville Predators? And how good are they? So our Locked On NHL Prospects crew, they recently sat down and looked at the Nashville Predators prospect pool in depth and where it ranks amongst the other teams in the NHL. So here's what they had to say about the Nashville Predators prospect pipeline. We're going to get their take on it. Let's listen in.
All right, so moving on to our second team and our second segment, team 13 in our countdown to the best prospect pool in the NHL, we have got the Nashville Predators. Now, for me personally, what separates the Preds from the Jets, it's a very narrow margin. I mean, we racked our heads a lot, kind of breaking down this kind of glut between 20 and I'd say like 8 to 7. It's been a really, really tight kind of range of teams. But for me, the main separator is first and foremost Yaroslav Askarov, an extremely solid goaltender prospect who hasn't reached the cutoff yet for our kind of breakdown for prospects, which for goalies is about 15 or 20 games. We were a bit less generous with the forwards with 10 games as our cutoff. But for me, Yaroslav Askarov really pushed the Preds ahead of the Winnipeg Jets because at forward, it's fairly similar outside of Brad Lambert. They've got the likes of Joachim Kamel, Matthew Wood, who they just recently added. They added Aiden Fink, who I'm a big fan of, and with their last pick of the 7th round, the last pick of their former GM's career as well. Felix Nielsen's fairly interesting, but let's go through some of these names. We'll start off with Matthew Wood. I like what I've seen, and he's a player, another player who reminds me a lot of Tyler Toffoli. I know you've had that comparable all year. Is that the easiest comparable outside of maybe Oliver Moore and Dylan Larkin? Is there another easier comparable than that, or is that kind of the easiest kind of comparison you can bring to a player?
It was among the only player comps I was confidently making all year long.
Yeah.
I think that there are definitely some differences. I think Matthew Wood is a lot more powerful. He's clearly a lot bigger than Toffoli.
Yeah.
But in terms of the combination of a great shot, great off-puck movement, decent handling skill and an overall underrated offensive toolkit, I can see a lot of comparisons between the two. I think, obviously, on the defensive side of things, Toffoli grew a lot after his draft year, and Matthew would have to grow a similar amount to catch up to Toffoli in terms of being a full 200-foot forward. But this is a player where the sky is the limit, and he grew on me as the year progressed quite consistently. I think that he really showed a ton of progression, learning how to play against higher end competition, learning how to use his physicality and how to compensate for poor skating and how to still be a highly effective NCAA player. He started using a lot more delays. He is very aware that his skating is a limitation, and he uses every other tool he has to compensate for it really intelligently. And while he is not a slam dunk top 6 player in the NHL, he has all the tools to become that type of piece with another 3 or 4 years of development. So apart from Askarov, he probably is my favorite player in this prospect pool. I think he's a couple of steps ahead of Joakim Kamel in terms of pure upside. I think that he's a far stronger handler. I think the shooting skill is comparable, but Wood has more growing room there. And Matthew Wood has really shown a lot of playmaking growth in the last year as well, whereas Kamel is still a little bit predictable as being primarily a shooter.
Yeah, on top of having Wood and Askarov as two kind of high upside pieces at the top of their prospect pool, you've got a lot of depth here. I mean, Tanner Molendyk, for me, very, very good bet. I mean, I probably wouldn't have taken him in the 20s, but for me, he has the rush defending of an NHLer already. And if you can just make him a tiny bit more well-rounded, work on his on his stick handling ability, make him more confident with the puck, just bring out that toolkit a bit more. He's got the skating and the rush defending to be a very, very good piece in the future in the NHL. You've got on top of that a guy like Felix Nielsen, who they added in the second round last year, who I'm a huge fan of. You know that fairly well. I'm a huge fan of his, and for me, he just screams NHLer. The board game, the pro habits, the inside game. I mean, I'm a big fan of what he brings, and I feel like it's just a matter of time before he's wearing a Preds jersey. Then you add to that Joey Willis, who they added in the mid rounds. Joey Willis is another of those kind of high floor, low ceiling type of players who can absolutely work it defensively. I mean, he outworks a lot of players on any given shift. Ryan Ufko's in there as kind of a depth piece. Jack Mateer. I mean, there's a lot of depth here. Do you feel like that's what pushes him above the Winnipeg Jets?
For sure. I mean, there's a lot of pieces in this Nashville pool, and a lot of them aren't guarantees for sure, but with that quantity, you are going to find some decent depth. And guys that we haven't even mentioned yet are like Reed Schaefer, who was a big piece in the return for Matthias Ekholm, who, in my view, doesn't really have too much top 6 upside, but could be a really fun bottom 6 energy guy. Luke Evangelista is also a skilled, slightly undersized forward who could push for a top 9 role in a couple years' time. You have a lot of pieces here. I think Callan Lind was a really nice pickup at the draft this past season and fits their identity perfectly in terms of adding intensity and grit and violence in a package that also has a decent goal scoring and some playmaking flashes. There's a lot of fun players in here, and I think one last one I'll throw into the mix before I let you go off with your last couple ones would be Kasper Kolonumi. This is a player who's a fairly mobile, intelligent defensive defenseman who won't be a stalwart top 4 piece necessarily, but could be a really reliable number 5. And I've always respected the way he plays the game. I think he got picked a little bit later than he probably should have in 2022. And he will marinate over in Finland for a couple years probably at this point. But I think the Preds could get a decently effective number 4, number 5 defenseman out of him.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a player who brings violence and goal scoring ability. And it's just funny that we haven't even mentioned Zachary Lheureux in this conversation, because that's him to a T. I'm not sure how far his temper is going to take him, because it's pretty absurd. I think he got in a fight with a fan. He speared a fan in the queue, but he's going to be playing in the AHL. He's going to be surrounded by pros who are going to kind of keep him in check. And hopefully he can take that temper and redirect it on the ice in a way that really helps his game, because man, he's got some skill about him. He's able to make plays really well. He's able to find pockets of space to shoot from. His skating's decent enough that I'm not worried about him being able to keep up with pro pace. So we'll see what he brings with Milwaukee this year. We haven't even mentioned Anton Olsen on D. We haven't even mentioned Adam Ingram. Yeah, Adam Ingram is a fantastic pick for me. I was a big fan of his in this draft here, and he's looked pretty good so far. So a lot of depth pieces. Even Dylan McKinnon could be in that conversation. They got a lot of viewings on him from watching the Halifax Mooseheads. So I'm sure that kind of played into their pick of him, a safe guy. And obviously Luke Prokop, who's the first openly gay prospect or junior player from the CHL. And he's been playing really well. He was traded to a contender, played really well there. And we'll see where he goes from there with Milwaukee this year. So there's a lot to like here. But for me, the teams above them just kind of edge them out in terms of both the solidity of their depth and on top of that, the quality that they have in their roster. So we'll get into that very, very soon.
All right, thanks again to Hadi and Sebastien for that. You can catch them every day on the Locked On NHL podcast show if you want to hear what they had to say about the other NHL teams. Still to come, we are going to be talking about Nashville Predators fantasy projections, who are going to be some of the top players for the Preds this year. But first, want to remind you again, Locked On Predators is your free daily Nashville Predators podcast, available wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. It really helps us out. We are going to be talking more about the Central Division here in the coming weeks. We've already had some good frenemy podcasts with Haley over at Locked On Blues and the cast and crew of Locked On Avalanche. We have more. We're going to be doing crossovers with Locked On Wild, Locked On Blackhawks, and Locked On Coyotes here in the coming weeks. So make sure you guys are tuned in to every single show. All right, the Nashville Predators fantasy projections for 2023-24. It's hockey's coming back when we talk about fantasy projections. I'm sure everybody is ready to get their draft started. NHL.com recently came out with the top Nashville Predators fantasy projections for this coming season. No surprise. It's pretty much the main guys that you think are up the top. So the top fantasy player that they have this season for the Nashville Predators is Roman Josi. They have him ranked 36 in the NHL and fantasy this year. They talk about him leading defenseman in points over the past couple of years, and how he's going to probably take on a bigger role with Johansson and Duchesne gone. They have him as a 71-point projection this seaon. To me, that's about what Roman Josi had done before his insane, 96-point season a little bit ago. To me, that's about where I have Roman Josi too. Mainly because, one, we're not exactly sure what his role is going to look like under Andrew Brunette. Is it going to be more involved in the offense like it was under John Hines? Is he going to kind of go back to maybe being more of a two-way guy, maybe taking some more shifts on the defensive end? That'll hurt his numbers a little bit, but he's still a guy who's capable of 70 points. So I think that's a reasonable goal there. The second highest ranked Predator on NHL.com's fantasy ranked 90th was Philip Forsberg. They talked about him having a big year potentially with Ryan O'Reilly. They have him with a 70-point projection this year. That's another tough one because, again, we don't know what Andrew Burnett's role is going to be on this team. Now, here's one. UC Saros ranked 91st in fantasy. They have him projected to get 30 wins this year. They also on the list, Ryan O'Reilly ranked 131st in fantasy with a 63-point projection. Yeah, I mean, it's tough because a lot of fantasy depends on, kind of the numbers and stuff, and you don't see a lot of, the two-way value and metrics and stuff like that. So the thing with UC Saros, I know a lot of people are looking at this and being like, oh, how is he just, way down here buried on the fantasy, goalies protection? He's a top 3 goalie in the NHL. He is. It might just not completely translate to, being good fantasy. The thing with UC Saros is like his save percentage is maybe a little bit lower than some other goalies on this list because he's, stopping 42 of 45 instead of, 24 of 25 as opposed to, like Linus Ullmark last year. And it's also, you get a lot of points for a win if you're a starting goalie in fantasy. And the Predators, jury's out to see if they win a lot of games this year. I mean, they do have them ranked in the top 10 in fantasy goalies, but yeah, I mean, that's going to be a tricky thing because a lot of UC Saros fantasy success probably depends on the Nashville Predators success. And then Ryan O'Reilly at, let's see, they had him projected at 63 points. That's optimistic. I will say that, so we'll have to see about that. Interesting that they also listed some other NHL players to consider in fantasy. Tyson Barrie, no surprise there, a high scoring defenseman, got 50 points last year, could contend for, another 50 this year, especially with some healthy players up front. Tommy Novak, that's another interesting one because he had such a high scoring season last year. Is he going to replicate that season? They had Juuso Parssinen ranked as a player to watch. Interesting that they picked him over some other guys like Luke Evangelista and Cody Glass. Maybe they know something about what Andrew Burnett wants to do. And then the last pick, the last player they had, or they're telling people to consider taking in fantasy, Yaroslav Askarov. I don't know if they're just not reading the Nashville Predators depth chart or if this is just a very, very bold opinion on, maybe about how they project him coming into the lineup this year. Either way, you might want to wait until the very, very last round to take Yaroslav Askarov if that's the route you want to go down. But it should be an interesting season if you're picking all Preds in fantasy because, again, we don't know how this team plays. And that's, you not only got to consider like the players coming up and taking that next step forward, but how are some of the guys like Philip Forsberg and Roman Josi going to play in Andrew Burnett's system? Are they going to be used in that same way that they were when John Hines, when each had that wildly successful high-scoring season? Or does John Hines envision a new role for them? Is there somebody else in the team? Maybe a Luke Evangelista that's going to get a more high-profile role. So these are all things to consider when drafting your Nashville Predators. You may not have a good sense about which Predators are going to be good for your fantasy team until the season actually starts. So, maybe just be a little bit cautious of that. That is going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Predators podcast. Thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day. You can catch me every day on the Locked On Predators podcast. You can find my work at penaltyboxradio.com. Follow me on Twitter at _NSMorgan. Also, be sure to follow my colleague, Ann Kimmel. You can read her work at InsideThePreds.com and follow her on Twitter at AnnK_Mama on Ice. We'll be back tomorrow with an all-new episode. We'll see you then.